Some of the best investments I ever made didn't show up on spreadsheets. They didn't come with ticker symbols, dividends, or shareholder reports. They looked like conversations I almost didn't have, regrets I finally admitted, and one walk down to the dock that changed everything. In this story, I'm going to tell you about a voicemail I didn't know I saved, a son I lost without ever losing custody, and the reason I left the world that once applauded me, only to find silence waiting on the other side. It's a story about appearances, about the cost of always being on, about what happens when you realize the person you've been performing for no longer recognizes you. So pour your coffee, or just listen to the sound of the waves, because this one isn't just about money, it's about value, the kind that doesn't come with a price tag, but changes everything once you finally see it. You can spend your whole life chasing numbers and still not know your own value. That's how I start most of my mornings now. Not with a market forecast, not with a checklist, not even with coffee, but with a single sentence that hits me like a whisper from a version of myself I ignored for decades. Today's whisper was that one. The sun had barely broken over the horizon, and the tide was low, dragging small secrets into the shore. I sat at the edge of my deck, wood weathered like my hands, wearing nothing but swim trunks, a pair of beat-up sunglasses, and a smirk only loneliness teaches you to wear right. Behind me, my cabin creaked softly in the breeze. No screens, no phones, just the ocean. A notebook with frayed pages and a camera on a tripod I rarely looked into. I didn't need to. I wasn't filming for fame. I was filming for someone who might need a warning before they win the wrong war. There was a time I woke up to Bloomberg terminals and algorithms screaming at me from 8 screens. There was a time I drank espresso like it was oxygen and checked futures prices before I kissed a woman good morning, assuming there even was a woman still there. But the market I traded in for years wasn't Wall Street. Not really. It was time, and I lost more of it than I ever should have. So I left. I left before anyone could tell me to. I left when the world thought I was on top. I bought silence with the money that once bought influence, and I moved to a place where no one would come unless they were lost enough to find me. The first thing you learn when you quit everything is this: winning was never the problem. It was the goal itself that was broken. Most people don't want to hear that. They come to my channel hoping I'll tell them how to 10x their portfolio, how to time the dip, how to scale, sell, dominate, how to beat their rivals and build generational wealth. Whatever that means to someone who hasn't spoken to their own children in weeks. But I don't do that here. I tell them stories instead, like the story of Aaron, young kid, maybe 26. Sent me a long message last year, full of questions but also full of rage disguised as ambition. He wanted to know what I would have done in his shoes. Startup founder, Series A secured, massive expectations. He was burning through 18-hour workdays like kindling. Said he hadn't seen sunlight in a month, but it was fine because, in his words, the grind is the proof. I didn't respond immediately. I let his message sit in my inbox for a week. Then I recorded a 3-minute video. No cuts, no edits. I said, burning doesn't prove you're on fire. Sometimes it just proves you're disposable. And then I closed the video with a simple question. Who are you when no one is watching your metrics? He didn't reply for months. Then, one morning, a handwritten letter showed up at the edge of my dock. Literally, in a bottle. Inside, his words were shaky, like they'd been written with the hand of someone finally letting go. He'd quit. Not just the startup, the story he was trying to live. Turns out, he wasn't building a company. He was building a shield against failure, against emptiness, against admitting he never wanted any of it to begin with. I remember rereading that letter that night, barefoot in the sand, and thinking, maybe this is what returns should have always looked like. The ocean's full of metaphors if you pay attention. Some days it gives, some days it takes, but it never pretends to be something it's not. People, not so much. Most folks I coached during my time wore suits that cost more than honesty. They spoke fluent performance. They knew how to pitch, pivot again. They didn't know how to be still. Stillness is expensive, I've learned. It costs you pride, costs you narrative. Sometimes it costs you your audience. But stillness is where truth speaks. And here, in this forgotten corner of the world, I've learned to listen. I wasn't always this poetic, by the way. There was a time I would have mocked this version of myself, called him soft, weak, said he'd lost his edge. But I've come to learn the edge I used to fight for, it was cutting all the wrong things. I lost a marriage because I wouldn't reschedule a meeting. I missed my father's funeral because I didn't want to break a negotiation streak. I made $1 billion. I spent it buying back the time I threw away. Still in deficit. The viewers of this channel don't know my name. They don't need to. They know the sound of the waves behind me. They know the way my voice drops when I talk about regret. They know I never look directly at the camera unless I'm about to say something that hurts. Sometimes I'll be halfway through a story when I stop, lean back and say, "You're not gonna like this part." And that's when they lean in, because they know it's coming. The truth. I remember once saying, no one wakes up to fail. But the real kicker? No one wakes up to succeed either. They just wake up. And then the noise begins. My life used to be all noise. Now, it's tide, breeze, thought. And this morning, the thought that wouldn't leave was this. Maybe the biggest profit I ever made is learning when to walk away. I got up from the deck, stretched, and grabbed my notebook. There was a list I started years ago, back when I first arrived here. Things I should have known before my first million. Only had 2 items on it. No one claps for the person who finally slows down. Winning isn't worth it if you have to lose yourself to get there. Today, I added a 3rd. 3. If you can't sit with silence, you're not ready to hear the truth. The wind picked up. The tide began to turn. And just before I walked back inside to record the next video, I looked out at the horizon and whispered, "What if they're not ready to hear it?" Then I answered myself, "Then say it softer, but say it anyway." I turned on the camera, sat down, looked straight into the lens, and began. Let me tell you what Wall Street never taught me about love. I knew how to read a market. I never learned how to read a woman's silence. That line, I wasn't ready to say it aloud, but it slipped out anyway, in one of those quiet monologues I record when the tide's at its lowest and the moon's still bleeding silver across the water. It was meant to be a story about due diligence, but it became a confession about my ex-wife. Her name doesn't matter now. She probably wouldn't want it spoken here, not in a video, not by me. But I remember her hands, how they moved like they were always solving something invisible. She used to draw plans for buildings she never intended to build, said it helped her think. I never paid attention to what she was drawing, only to whether she brought me coffee while I ran my morning trades. That's the kind of man I used to be. The investors listening now think I'm wise. But wisdom isn't what happens when you win. It's what remains after you've ruined things. There's a myth in business that good instincts are enough, that you can feel your way through markets, negotiations, expansions. Let me tell you something real. My instincts were perfect. My priorities were poisoned. I was in Tokyo closing a deal that would double the fund's valuation. She called me, barely able to breathe, said she was at the ER. I told her I'd call her back in 20. I never did. By the time I landed back in the States, she'd already left the house, left a note, not dramatic, not angry, just tired. She said, "You keep showing up for the future. I needed you in the present." I talk about her now because some of you watching think this life is about hustle, that love will wait, that family is background noise, that your relationships are assets, optional, expendable, reconfigurable. They're not. They're the only thing you'll wish you could rebuy when the portfolio's full, but the house is empty. That morning, I said something to the camera I hadn't planned. If your calendar has no space for a name that isn't a client, you're already bankrupt. The comment section lit up. Some agreed, some raged. One person wrote, "Easy for you to say from your island with your millions." Maybe. But you think this place feels like a reward. This island is a penance. Not because of what I did, but because of what I didn't. There's a drawer in my cabin. I rarely open it. Inside, a watch that belonged to my father. A photo of my son on his 5th birthday. A letter I wrote but never sent. And a check, unsigned, uncashable, made out to a charity my ex believed in. I call it my Assets That Matter drawer. It's worth more than anything I ever traded. But let me talk about Raymond, one of my subscribers, mid-50s, divorced twice, still working 80-hour weeks trying to rebuild a company that's already lost its pulse. He sent me a message with just 2 lines. How do you know when it's over? And how do you stop needing it to keep going? I didn't respond for 2 days. Then I filmed something raw. I sat under the palm tree near the old kayak. The camera was crooked. Wind was loud. I said, "You stop needing it when you remember what it cost you the first time. You know it's over. When you start rehearsing excuses before you speak to your daughter." I didn't hear from him again until 6 weeks later. He sent a photo. Him, fishing with a little girl holding a plastic rod. Caption read, "My granddaughter. I forgot I promised her I'd teach her this before she turned 5. She's 4. I remembered just in time. The turning point wasn't in the market. It was in his blood." You can always restart a company. But when relationships flatline, there's no IPO to save you. And that's the thing no one teaches in business school. Growth isn't always up and to the right. Sometimes growth means stopping. Sometimes it means letting it go before it eats you alive. There's a quote I once scribbled in a notebook after a meditation retreat I barely survived in silence. If your life were a stock chart, could you live with the dips if the final shape was peace? That's all I want now. Not dominance, not dividends, just peace. But peace has a price. And part of that price is remembering the faces you traded away. I hadn't said his name in years, but that morning, sitting by the water, I whispered it. Eli, my son. The camera was still rolling. I looked straight at the lens and said, "He used to call me Dad. Now he calls me that man who always had meetings." And then I got up and walked away from the frame. There are echoes louder than any storm. It started with a voice. Not from inside my head. Not this time, but from an old voicemail I'd forgotten I'd saved. I was digging through a broken flash drive I kept in a rusted tin behind the bookshelf, hoping to recover an old speech I once gave at the Global Investment Forum in 2007. A speech, ironically, about the legacy of clarity. What I found instead was his voice. "Hey, it's Eli. Mom says you're in Switzerland or maybe Singapore. Not sure. Anyway, I had a game today. We lost, but I scored. Just thought maybe you'd want to know. All right. Later." It cut off early. I played it 5 times. I had never heard it before. The recording was dated 11 years ago. He would have been 15, old enough to stop waiting for his dad to show up, young enough to still hope he might. That night the tide slammed hard against the rocks like it was trying to break in. I didn't light the lantern, didn't open the camera, didn't eat. I just sat there, feet in the sand, notebook in hand, and wrote. I knew how to read trends, but I never read what mattered. I used to believe discipline was everything, and maybe it is, if you're building systems. But if you're building relationships, then it's presence. And I was absent. Brilliantly, relentlessly absent. The people who admired me called it focus. The people who loved me called it abandonment. Only one of them was right. The next morning, I recorded a video that almost didn't get published. In it, I asked a question no investor ever wants to hear. What happens when the portfolio grows, but the people shrink? I shared Eli's message. Then I shared something else. The letter he wrote to me when he turned 18. Never opened it until that day. His handwriting was sharper than I remembered. Clean. Angry. Controlled. Dad, I'm not mad anymore. I'm just tired. You taught me how to win, but you never taught me how to lose without breaking. I stopped reading after that. Burned the rest. Not because I was angry, because I was ashamed. And here's something no one tells you about success. It amplifies your shame. It puts spotlights on your regrets and plays reruns on every flat screen you thought you earned. But life's funny. The next day, I received a message from Eli. After all these years. Short. Ironic. Almost cruel in how simple it was. Mom told me about your little island show. Guess you finally made time. I didn't know if it was sarcasm, curiosity, or a setup for something deeper. So I responded the only way I knew how. I told him the truth. I recorded a private video. I didn't defend myself. Didn't list my donations, board seats, or awards. Didn't send charts about college funds or private school tuition. I told him about the nights I drank scotch instead of calling. About the time I watched his graduation speech on mute while preparing a pitch deck. About how every morning I wake up knowing the smartest investment I ever could have made was time. This was the Revira Volta, not the voicemail, not the letter. But me, finally admitting, not publicly but privately, that I failed. The man who taught thousands how to manage risk was terrified of emotional loss. So he hedged. He hedged everything that mattered most. I told Eli I didn't expect a reply, just that I wanted him to know the truth, while I still had breath to say it. Then I hit send. And I waited. 3 days. Nothing. A week. Nothing. I started filming again, trying to shake it off. Told stories about market crashes, about deals I should have walked away from, about the time a CEO tried to bribe me with a private jet, and I almost said yes. But every word felt stale, like I was speaking through a window I couldn't open. Until one morning at dawn, I heard the sound of oars slicing through water. I stepped out onto the deck. A small rental canoe, bright red, cut through the fog. Inside it was him. Older, taller, beard, same eyes. He didn't wave, didn't shout, just paddled closer, dropped anchor near the dock and said, "Thought maybe we could talk off camera." I nodded once, then turned off the camera for the first time in years. You can spend your whole life chasing numbers and still not know your own value. That was the first thing I ever said on this channel. And it echoed again, not from a camera, not from a notebook, but inside my chest, as I watched my son step onto the dock with a backpack slung low and eyes that looked like mine used to, before I buried them in quarterly reports and closing bells. He didn't hug me, didn't punch me, just stood there, quiet, waiting for me to speak first. So I did what I hadn't done in over a decade. I listened. We sat facing the sea, 2 feet apart, a thermos of black coffee between us. The tide was rising, slow, relentless, honest. He talked first, not about me, about himself, his work, his therapy, his daughter, my granddaughter, whom I'd never met. He didn't ask for anything, didn't offer forgiveness, just told the truth. And I let him. At one point he asked, "Why now?" I looked at the ocean for a long time before answering, because silence was safer, until it became the thing killing me slowly. He nodded. Once. That was it. But it was everything. We didn't solve anything that day. We didn't cry. There was no dramatic handshake, no orchestral swell in the background. Just 2 men on a dock, trying. That night, after he'd gone, promising to return next month, not making it a big deal, I sat by the fire pit alone. I didn't film anything, didn't write, just stared at the flames until the stars took over the sky like spectators at a quiet redemption. I thought about all the things I'd lost, but I didn't feel poor. In the morning, I recorded a new video, the final one, at least for a while. I sat where I always sit, but I was different, not because he came, but because I finally let go of needing him to. I looked into the camera and said, maybe what we call failure is just the moment the wrong dream finally dies. Then I told them the truth. I spent most of my life trying to matter. Now I spend my days trying to mean something. There's a difference. Mattering is noise. Meaning is signal. I closed the video with a story about the market crash of '08. Not because it was relevant, but because I wanted to remind them, value isn't what people are willing to pay. Value is what something's worth when no one else is bidding. Before I shut off the camera, I added one last sentence. If you're watching this because you think success will fix you, stop. Fix yourself first. Then decide what success even means. The next day, I walked to the edge of the island with a weathered journal tucked under my arm. Inside it were 78 entries, all titled the same way. What I wish I knew sooner. Some were business tips, most were not. I left it on a rock where the waves couldn't reach, but the wind might carry it. and I walked away barefoot. I don't know who will find it, or if anyone will. That's not the point. Some wisdom isn't meant to go viral. It's meant to rescue one person quietly, even if that person is you. I used to close deals with a signature. Now I close days with silence, and I sleep better. I still don't know if Eli forgives me, but I forgive the man I used to be. Not because he was right, but because he finally stopped running. You can spend your whole life chasing numbers, but until you stop, you'll never know your own value. If you made it this far, thanks for staying. Not everyone does. Most people just want the shortcut, the secret, the fix. But if you're still here, maybe it means you're ready to look a little deeper. I don't have a course to sell you. I'm not building a brand. I'm just a man who made a lot of wrong turns and finally had the sense to sit down and talk about it. So thank you for listening, for thinking, for slowing down, even if no one claps when you do.